Welcome everybody to our first roundtable of the year. We will be exploring the blurring lines between coaching and therapy and ask, is this an inevitable evolution? My name is Isabella Miller. I'm the Programs and Events Manager here at Animas, and I'm going to be facilitating the conversation today. I'll also be here to support you should you need anything during the 90 minutes we are together. Just to note as well that unfortunately Gemma Borden, who was originally supposed to be here tonight, won't be able to join us. So she's not here tonight, but we have 4 brilliant speakers who are going to be joining us tonight and covering this exciting topic. So I'm going to start and introduce Steve Peralta, who is a coach and the co-founder of Unmind, a leading global workplace mental health company that helps employees take proactive care of their mental health while helping organizations foster healthier workplace cultures. Joining him is Rebecca Minton, who is the head of Therapies and Coaching at Unmind. Rebecca is an accredited cognitive behavioural therapist who previously led mental health services in both the NHS with 2 digital providers and now oversees therapy and coaching at Unmind, ensuring it is safe, effective and high quality. We're also thrilled to welcome Anita, who is a coach, motivational speaker and occupational psychologist. Anita has previously delivered impactful training on our trauma and coaching program, and along with Steve, we'll be speaking at our upcoming mental health in coaching program, which launches this month. And finally, we have Simon Tomkins, founder of Simon Tomkins Coaching, a life coaching company specialising in helping people, ambitious leaders, avoid stress and burnout to thrive personally and professionally. Simon will also be leading some sessions in our mental health in coaching program. So a few house rules. So as I've mentioned, please do keep yourself on mute throughout the discussion. If you need something, you'll be able to message me directly using the chat function. And like I said, if we find that through facilitating that doesn't work, we have lovely people on the call who might be able to help us with that. So I also asked today that if you have an AI note taker, that you would please remove it due to confidentiality reasons. Around 7 p.m, we will have some time for questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask that you keep these questions in the chat rather than speaking them out into the space, and I'll read them out for the speaker who answer. Please also be aware that this meeting is going to be recorded and will be able to be accessed on our YouTube channel. Okay, so that was my little introduction. I'm going to begin the discussion now. We have a list of questions here that we're hoping to get through tonight. And yes, so let's begin. The first question that I have for our speakers: what do you see as the distinction between the 2 practices? And I'm going to start with Steve. Do you want to jump in?
Sure, thanks, Izzy. And hello, everyone. It's great to see you all on the call. I guess before I start to answer the question, just share that, I'm a coach, not a therapist. I've been working in the space of mental health for the past decade as co-founder of Unmind, and I've got to work alongside clinical psychologists, positive psychologists, organizational psychologists. So I take a lot of my perspective from that experience, but also just my experience as a human being who has experienced coaching, as in I've worked with a coach and with a therapist. And so I'm also drawing on that as I answer these questions. But this question, what I see is the distinction between coaching and therapy. I think through the lens of this conversation, I think it's important to say that both coaching and therapy help people improve their mental health. So I think that's an important thing to say first of all. But I think the distinction lies in the focus and, well, let's say the primary focus and primary goal of both of those disciplines. Like nothing we say today is going to be black and white and perfect, perfectly applicable to every situation, right? This is nuanced. But I do think, if we're speaking simply here, the distinction is that therapy and therapists have been trained to treat mental illness and process trauma, and coaches typically haven't, right? But coaches have been trained to help people with self-discovery, and growth and to be empowered towards flourishing. That's the way I see it. And both of those focuses are important when we think about mental health. So for me, I came across a model a few years back, which we've used at Unmind, which I think is a useful one for today's conversation. You may have come across it. It's called the dual continuum model. But I think this helps us to better understand what complete mental health is, and also where therapy has a role to play and where coaching has a role to play. So typically the way we think of mental health is along a single continuum with problems on the one end and thriving on the other end, right? And that if you reduce problems, you automatically move towards thriving, and vice versa. But the research shows that that's not the case, right? So the dual continuum model, you can think of it as two axes. They are distinct but complementary. So you have an x-axis, let's call that the mental ill health axis. And on the one end, there's severe symptoms, and on the other end, there's no symptoms, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that the person's got positive mental health or are flourishing, but it means no symptoms. You could think of that being the primary domain of therapy and the therapists. That's where their prime focus is, right? Then we have the y-axis, which you can think of, let's say, the mental well-being axis or positive mental health axis. You've got languishing on the one end and flourishing on the other end. You could think of that as being the primary domain of coaching. Now, these coexist, right? You could think of it as creating four quadrants. And although this is, more nuanced, you could think of a person fitting into one of those four quadrants. What the research shows, though, and this is important, and this speaks to the nuance, is that a person can have a diagnosed mental health condition. So let's say they're along the side of the x-axis, but they can also be empowered to experience greater degrees of well-being and move towards flourishing with the diagnosed mental health condition. And likewise, someone might have no diagnosed mental health condition, no symptoms, but they might be languishing, right? So it shows you that it's complex territory and that this is nuanced. And there's not a broad sort of a brushstroke that we can paint across all coaches and therapists. But I think a useful way of thinking about it is this x-axis is the domain of therapy and the y-axis is the domain of coaching. Obviously, the map is not the territory and we are complex, messy human beings, but I do think that's a helpful way of thinking about it.
Thank you, Steve. That's great. I'm going to bring Anita in here as well to answer that first question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Izzy, and nice to see so many familiar faces this evening. And just to build on what Steve was articulating is really about the distinctions. And actually, when I was going through my Animas training, a really great distinction was that coaching is about the present and the future, and therapy is very much rooted in the past. So it is about resolving past traumas within therapy. And I suppose some of the distinctions can be that in therapy, you might be, someone, as Steve was saying, have a mental illness and be struggling with some of the symptoms and be struggling with day-to-day life, engaging with relationships, interacting with others. So that's, I suppose, a space in therapies where you can do some of that work. And I suppose it's, if someone has a diagnosis, some of the symptoms are going to be quite tricky. And I'm a qualified coach, and I'm currently going through training to be a therapist. So the amount of time I'll spend in education, practice, student placement, I will be a lot more familiar with sort of mental health diagnoses and how you might work with a client. Whereas with coaching, for example, with Animas, the amount you spend in education and not covering sort of those areas that we would in the therapy sort of course is quite different, and prepares you differently to deal with those scenarios that you might meet with a client. And with coaching, it tends to be more about, what are some of the goals? So where are you now? What are you working towards? And how can I support you in getting there? And I think it is also impossible in coaching to not look at some of the past. That is obviously going to predict or inform how the person is today. So that's, I think, in that respect, is not so clear cut. So some of the past will come into the coaching perspective. And a person will be held accountable and empowered and be expected to go and implement things and do things differently. Whereas through therapy, that will be a lot more difficult if someone's kind of in that space where they're struggling with their mental health. So it is, being prepared as a mental health professional to deal with things like what might present in from a trauma perspective, from a mental illness. And there'll be different frameworks that a therapist might be trained in. And with coaches, it's more about optimizing performance, how it's action orientated, it's very practical. It's not so clear cut, but I think those are some of the distinctions in my mind. It's the level of training, the level of expertise, the level of understanding, and be able to draw into that toolkit that you would have learned through your training to actually support someone in getting to where they need to get to.
Thank you, Anita. I'm just going to ask Rebecca or Simon, have you got anything to add to that question, or are you happy for me to move on?
Yeah, I was just going to add, hi, everyone. I'm speaking, I guess, from a therapist angle, holding in mind coaching as well. I guess picking up on some of the things that just been said, I agree with what Anita and Steve had said. I think it's a really grey area sometimes and quite tricky. And I think talking about therapy, I would say there's so many different types of therapies that all work in different ways. And some of the therapies, so thinking about cognitive behavioural therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy, those therapies are very focused on goals and values and strengths. And there is that overlap with coaching. And I think in CBT, for example, we will look back and kind of look at somebody's earlier experiences that they've been through that help shape who they are today. But the primary focus is on the present and the future and helping support them in that way. And likewise, people will come to therapy for different reasons. And not everybody coming to therapy is going to have a diagnosis or severe mental health problems. So again, that's exactly what we're talking about today, the sort of blurred lines, I guess, between who might be accessing which and those differences between therapy and coaching.
Thanks, Rebecca. Simon, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would probably just say something. And firstly, great to meet everyone. We've not met before, but I hope to connect with you again soon. I think compared to some of the guys that have spoken, I might be newer to the world of coaching. I've definitely come from a coaching stance. But I just think that this is, just even trying to define the difference between the two shows how important this discussion is. And the word nuance that keeps coming up is just so relevant. So I think that's really important just for us all to bear in mind is we're people that we live in the world of personal development, self-discovery and reflection. We have language, we have tools and understanding. And so we have a framework, even though it's nuanced for us, there can be grey areas and blurred lines. So for people coming into coaching or therapy who have absolutely no experience with all of this stuff, for them, of course, it can be even harder to understand. And of course, there are so many stories and narratives and preconceptions around what is coaching, what is therapy. And so I just think that all of the really valuable things that have already been mentioned showcase how important it is for us to be clear, because if we can't be pretty clear on this stuff, then the people that need our help are definitely going to struggle to understand what they need.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, I'm going to move on to the second question. What are the risks of these blurring boundaries? And again, I'm going to start with Steve for this one.
I think, the primary risk is obviously harm to the client, right? I mean, I think that is a primary risk that we have to acknowledge. If a coach ventures into territory that they're not equipped to venture into, or they are not trained to navigate, then they do risk harming a client, right? So if they are, for example, try and treat a mental health condition or try and work on trauma with the client, and they don't have the capacity to do so, the trained capacity to do so, then certainly you might re-traumatize a client. You might make matters worse. So I think that's definitely important to acknowledge. That being said, like, not all coaches are the same. There might be coaches who have a wealth and a depth of experience and will be able to navigate those spaces better than others, right? But I think on the whole, if we're going to be ethical about this, we need to recognize that boundary. There is a less direct risk as well, I think, if a boundary is not honored. And I think that's if a therapeutic approach is maintained, let's say, for too long, when a client might actually be ready to move forward. You could think of that as harming the client, but in a less direct way, by not honoring their agency and their own empowerment and their sort of inner motivation and spark and so on, right? So we can look at it both ways. I think if we are clear about those boundaries, to the best degree that we can be, it protects, obviously protects the client, but also protects us as coaches, and ultimately will help the client get the right kind of support at the right time. And at Unmind, we always say that that's critical. The client needs to get the right support at the right time. So I think those are the main risks.
Thank you, Steve. Anita, did you want to follow up on that or add your thoughts to this question?
Yeah, I think for me, the primary thing is obviously the risk to the client, and things like re-traumatization can put them in a vulnerable position, especially when there's things like suicide risks involved and those kinds of things. And I think the risk is, inadequate support for someone in terms of what they need if they are struggling, if they, especially if they have a serious mental health diagnosis. And I think it's the whole thing around overstepping your ethical boundaries. So we're bound by ethical practice and who we license with, who we accredited with. So there's those risks of overstepping those marks. And I think, the burnout for coaches. So if a coach is working with a client who really clearly needs therapy, it can be burnout in terms of the worry of how you might have left a client. Are you equipped to give them what they need? And have you left them at risk? So again, that can be quite a lot for a coach to hold if they don't have the training, the practices and knowledge to be doing that. But also to flip it, the risk of, for example, if you're working with a coaching client and they clearly need therapy, but for some reason, they don't want to access therapy, but you can, in a way, hold space for them. So until they get to the point where they can go to a therapist. So it might be that they're in transition. So I think the risk of being actually saying, no, I can't do this, I can't work with you, there's a risk of leaving a client sort of left hanging, so to speak. So I think it's, can you support them and be clear about what you can support them with whilst they're transitioning, for example, to a therapist. So it's setting your boundaries in terms of what you can or what you can't work with. But as coaches, essentially, we hold space for our clients. So holding space till they get to what they need.
Thank you, Anita. Rebecca, I'm going to bring you in here as well now.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Anita and Steve had said. Not sure too much more to add to it. I think client protection, client harm is really, really important. The ethical side to it and professional credibility can be quite disheartening if you're working with a client and you're not getting very far with them, or it's not seen as successful. And that might be because the right approach is not being used for them. And of course, sometimes there could be legal implications to that as well. So it's worth holding in mind as well.
Thanks. Simon, was there anything you wanted to add, or are we okay to move on to the next question?
Just one small thing, I think. I totally agree with what everyone said, and you completely covered it. I think I have had personally a lot of people who I've connected with in the last 4 years who've been to therapy, not got the results they wanted, and then come to coaching. And, sometimes frustrated, sometimes disappointed, sometimes, a bit lost and confused about what to do. And often I think that was because they weren't sure where they should be and maybe weren't in the right place. Not always the case, but it just highlights, I think, that sometimes people are just looking to make positive change and move forwards in their life. And again, just due to lack of knowledge and education on what coaching is, what therapy is, end up with a therapist and maybe 12 months later think, I'm not sure this is, we're looking at the past and we're processing past events, but we haven't created change that they're expecting. So I think that actually really just touches on Steve's point as well, which is just around sort of disappointment and people being in a wrong place. And maybe then the impact that has on our profession in general of talking therapy, whether it be coaching or any other form of therapy.
I think there's one thing I just want to add to that. I think this question becomes particularly relevant when a person is in crisis or experiencing a severe mental health problem that's really dramatically impacting their function in life. Then this question becomes really relevant. There's degrees of mental health problems, right? I think the line becomes, the nuance is probably more, if you go back to the x-axis of the dual continuum model, the closer you get towards the middle and towards sort of no symptoms, less severe symptoms, it's less critical, let's say. Rebecca, Anita, Simon, I presume you'd agree with me here, but when a person is in crisis, I think it's very, very important that those boundaries aren't crossed. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to the third question. How might training companies respond to this shift? Rebecca, I might start with you for this one.
Yeah, I think thinking of this training generally rather than training companies, but I think it's really important that training covers, so training for coaches covers an understanding of the different types of therapies that are out there, to understand mental health conditions, understanding how to sort of spot symptoms, or that somebody might be struggling and might need therapy, and how you might have conversations around that and refer onwards if needed. Thinking about the therapy training I had, we learned very little about what coaching was or the differences between the two. That was a while ago now, so maybe the therapy training covers a bit more on it. But I think it's really important that both approaches consider this within the training. I think the other thing that's really important for me is how to have conversations with clients about setting expectations and talking about the limitations of what you offer, and to be able to do that in a confident way and feel comfortable to do that. Sometimes it can feel a bit daunting to be able to say, I'm sorry, I don't think I can help you here. So to be able to think about how to frame that conversation so that the client isn't left disheartened, and so that they can then be signposted onto the right approach. So yeah, I think summary training to cover different approaches, learning from one another, but also how to be aware of your own limitations and talk about those with the client as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's great. Simon.
Yeah, completely agree with everything Rebecca said. And I think it's really important that that training companies also spend some time recognizing and working with coaches to understand, right, that of course everyone's got a desire to go out and do great work and help people. That's why we do this, and that's normal and natural. And I think a lot of training companies increasingly include modules on the kind of sales and marketing coaching and the therapy. And I think that there's a kind of role here to make sure that to support people, to just really act with integrity in those situations and ensure that they are, correctly representing what they do and not straying, not crossing boundaries, which might be there, because of course I kind of want that client, although I know that actually what they're telling me probably means they need some therapy first, right? Or what I'm offering isn't necessarily the right modality for them right now at this point. And I just think that's a very real situation. There's a lot of people trying to build businesses, create an income, and do great work. And that desire is always going to be there to help the person that's come to you. So I think it's spending time with people to help them work out how they can do that, and just really encourage that level of integrity to actually say, you know what, I would like to refer you to someone else, or I would like to point you in that direction. And also learning how to do that. Because of course that's got to be handled in the right way. And it's something I've had to do a lot of times in the past, and actually we do that every week at the moment. At my company, where we are referring people elsewhere because we don't feel we've got exactly what they need to support them. So I think that's a really important thing. And it's just, it's compassion and understanding, isn't it? That we all have our desire to want to help people, but we have to know when it might not be right. So I think that's a huge one. And the other one would just be encouraging the role of supervision. In whatever form that might be, but I think regular supervision can be so helpful in understanding what's going on for you. Again, with my team, we have fortnightly group supervision sessions. It's 90 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, and it's such a powerful space that we can bring all kinds of coaching dilemmas and conversations into that space, and understanding if you are struggling with a client, or if you're coming up across things which you actually think, I took them on believing this was right, but I'm seeing something here which might suggest that therapy is more appropriate. Supervision is so powerful for that, and to kind of get the confidence and clarity from someone else, from your peers, to support you to maybe make a referral or act in an appropriate way. I think that's a really important thing. And believe, training companies is where the journey often starts for people. So that's the best time to bring these ideas into people's awareness. So that's the 2 key points from me.
Thank you, Simon. Anita or Steve, was there anything that you wanted to kind of add on?
Nothing for me. I think it's been covered, all that key points I agree with.
Yeah, I think most of the things that come to mind have been covered. Just, you made me think of an idea there, Simon. I mean, wouldn't it be great if training companies initiated or tried to facilitate more sort of cross-functional learning, like, mutual learning opportunities between therapists and coaches, perhaps try and create like an ecosystem where there's engagement between therapists and coaches. It hasn't really happened much to date. They're quite siloed, I think. So maybe there is an opportunity for training companies like Animas, for example, to take the lead on bringing coaches and therapists together to learn more about each other's disciplines and crafts, learn more about the boundaries, to facilitate referral networks. I mean, that could only be for the good, right? And I guess ultimately serve clients and patients. So I think that'd be a great idea.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, moving on to question 4. How can a coach know the line between the two and whether they are crossing it? I'm going to start with Anita for this one.
I think firstly, it's trusting your gut. If it feels like you're crossing the line and you're going into more of a therapeutic space, then you probably are. So I think it's tapping into, okay, how am I feeling? Does it feel overwhelming for me? Does it feel too much? Does it feel like we're focusing more on like unresolved trauma? And there's a lot of emotional dysregulation. There's a lot of sort of dysfunction in terms of how to regulate emotions and things like that. So I think if you're spending a lot of time in that space, as opposed to thinking about, okay, where are you now? What are you working towards? Some of the actions. And I suppose they're unable to engage fully in coaching, especially if they're in distress. They're unable to take actions forward. They don't feel they have the support, the environment, the conditions to do the work you might expect in coaching. Then that's, I think, red flags for you as a coach to understand actually this feels like it's we're working more in a different space. And again, going back to things like the suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation, self-harm, mental health crises, to really recognize some of those flags. And I suppose the way to recognize some of those flags is actually doing your education, doing your work. So, for example, the trauma program through Animas, that can help inform a coach of what to look out for when it feels like your client is maybe needing something else. And I think to know and maybe go back to, what is a contract? What have you contracted for with this client? What was your discussion at the start in terms of what you will work with, what you won't work with, their understanding expectations. So I think drawing on that to actually check in with yourself and then checking in with the client in terms of how are they finding the sessions, and having that discussion in terms of it feels like something more, and then it goes on to the signposting. So I think really trust yourself. And again, supervision is going to be really critical to help you to kind of break down some of these things and explore actually what's going on, what's needed, what action might need to be taken, and to really keep your client safe and yourself as a professional coach.
Thank you, Anita. Simon, did you want to jump in here as well?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Anita, I think covered a lot there and completely agree. And obviously mentioned supervision again, which would have been again a point I'd have sort of re-raised for this one. I guess I think it's important that that whether you're on the therapy or the coaching side or somewhere in the middle, I think it's important not to panic, right? When people bring things into a conversation which might immediately be a red flag. It comes back to the principles which underpin everything we do as coaches. So just bringing in our own awareness and being present in that moment, and to really understand that person, and just remember everyone's unique, everyone's journey is unique. If someone mentions something that you suddenly think, wow, I'm not qualified for this, it's okay maybe just to spend a moment there to understand it a little bit. So I think that's just one thing. I don't want sort of people to panic or think that if we discuss this thing that they've brought to, I'm suddenly crossing a line. Allowing someone to share and just to explore it lightly is probably really important to then be able to signpost. I guess is what I'm saying there. Again, as a coach, I know that a huge amount of people that I work with and my team work with are also in therapy, which is great, actually, right? And I think more and more people, this may come up later in our conversation today, but more and more people are choosing to do both side by side and starting to understand that both can be a really great support. So, of course, if someone's on a journey of discovery through therapy and they're also doing coaching with me, they may be referencing things that they're talking about with their therapist. And this is just an example that's quite a unique situation, but one just to bear in mind. I may let them bring some of that stuff in because they're kind of going through it, they're unpacking it, and it may well be relevant to the forward-looking change that we're there to create. So just bearing that particular situation in mind as well, I think is quite useful. Sometimes people may also be getting other support, and that may, I guess that word nuance again, right? That might mean that this can be nuanced. But I think that's it from me.
Thanks, Simon. That's great. Rebecca, can I invite you here as well?
Yeah, thanks. I think a couple of things I'd add to what's already been said. Some of the things that could be a sign that therapy might be more useful. Coaching could be if someone has persistent low mood or anxiety, it's been going on for a long time and it doesn't, it's getting worse or it isn't improving in some way. Another sign, I think, is when an individual is struggling to function or it's having an impact on their day-to-day life and the amount of time they might be spending focusing on that. So if they're spending a significant amount of time, for example, worrying or checking, then that could be a possible sign that therapy might be useful. I think things Anita touched upon: suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideation, self-harm, self-neglect, I think is something that comes up. How are people taking care of themselves and when that becomes a bigger issue? Sometimes, absolutely not always, but sometimes if someone is on medication, it might be useful to think about therapy alongside of that medication for a mental health problem. And it's also just useful to think about if they're accessing other mental health support. Sometimes that could mean that it's similar to what Simon said. Sometimes the coaching and therapy can be useful to be alongside each other. I sometimes find that tricky because it ends up with a lot of headspace for someone to have therapy and coaching at the same time. And if you're setting kind of tasks for them to do between sessions, it can feel quite a lot. But if somebody is accessing mental health support, it's worth having that conversation as to is coaching the right thing for you at this time as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to move on to the next question now. Where do the roles of coaching and therapy overlap, and how can they coexist ethically and effectively? Anita, I'm going to ask you to start with this one.
Yeah, it's interesting because through my Anita's weekend, I was on my study for my to become a therapist, and what I keep hearing, there's a shortage of therapists. So with that in mind, people might be reverting to coaches. So, I need some support. I'm struggling. I want to, achieve this change in my life. I've got this goal that I'm working towards. So they might go to a coach. And I suppose where some of the overlap is, it's about personal growth. So I suppose the underpinning thing with all of this is personal growth. I want to feel better. I want to do better. I want to change my life, whatever that might look like. So within both, it is going to be about, what are some of your values, your behaviors, what are the things that you want to shift, and how might you get that through things like mindset. In both areas, we might be supporting life transitions. So that could be big changes. So you get things like divorce coaches, grief coaches. So these things, start going into areas where there is going to be a lot of emotions that are going to be coming up in the coaching sessions. And it might be things around coping strategies and which kind of sit in both areas. Goal setting and problem solving. And I think in order for them to coexist, I think it goes back to the thing around what are your clear roles and what are the boundaries. So understanding your role as a coach and knowing, again, everything we've spoken about, when do you need to signpost, what are some of the signs, and then being able to communicate with your client about and be transparent, but what are your scope of your skills, your remit, how you're able to support them and when you might not be able to. And I think going back to the point that you made earlier, Steve, it's about how do you refer on and collaborate, perhaps potentially with a therapist who can support your client going forward. So it might be that you know of a good therapist and this is how they work, this is their areas of expertise, and you might be able to signpost. So I think as a coach yourself, having a referral list that you might want to refer on to a therapist, so you have that already there. And you might want to connect with therapists, get to know them so you can actually get a sense who you're referring on to. So I think it's, really approaching it with caution. I think that's the thing here. It's approaching all of this with caution if you're a coach. And it going back to everything we've spoken about is not kind of putting your client in a difficult or risky situation when there might be in a crisis. So, and I think this is where a lot of people might get confused that, coaching is about listening, it's about holding space, it's about the relationship, it's about empathy. Whereas a lot of those skills are relevant to both of those spaces, but it's knowing when your client's needs are changing, are different to what you can provide, what you have in your toolbox.
Thank you, Anita. Simon, did you want to jump in here as well?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for, kind of thanks for framing it that way, Anita. I think that's all just really helpful. I guess it is. It can be hard to understand. I think this is something that needs to be acknowledged. Is it can be hard to understand from an initial consultation sometimes what someone needs. Now, sometimes it's really obvious to us. In fact, sometimes from a written inquiry, we will know this is for coaching or this is for therapy. Sometimes on a breakthrough session that we have, which is up to an hour long with someone that wants to explore coaching, we'll know very clearly, okay, perfect. This is a great opportunity to do some really good work through coaching. And other times within that initial conversation, we might refer that person to therapy first or suggest that they explore therapy, signpost them appropriately. But it's not always possible to tell. And, I specialize in, and my team specializes in helping people avoid stress and deal with stress and burnout, right? To create balance. So we're all about taking people from stress, burnout, an unhealthy place to work-life harmony, right? So that everything's working nicely together. Now, of course, someone that's experiencing burnout can be in a really, really low place and experiencing quite a few of the things that you mentioned, Anita. So, they're feeling very down, they're feeling very stuck, they are in a constant low mood, a lot of these kinds of things. And yet sometimes it's caused literally because of the prolonged overwork and stress that they've experienced. And they can respond very, very well, really well to coaching and actually get to a really positive space within a very short amount of time. But sometimes people don't, and it depends because every single person's different, every situation's different, and trying to navigate that, is our challenge. And so I think that's important to acknowledge, that we may begin coaching someone believing that we can help them, but find out that's true, and it works really well. But sometimes we discover actually there's some deeper, more underlying things there that I, as a coach, or one of my coaches in my team can't go to. And that's where what we do, the answer we have for that is, before I have pause programs, I work with therapists. I refer them to have an initial conversation with the therapist. The therapist picks up and maybe works with them for however long it's necessary, sometimes slightly in tandem with me. Sometimes they work through that. I mean, it might be somatic kind of work that they might do, or other forms of therapy. And then they come back and we continue the journey. So I've had things like that happen. We also have composite programs now. So where it's like, you're not just going to do coaching or just do therapy. If you really want to go from the place you're in now to the place that you're describing, we're going to need to do both. And so that might be a 6 to 12 month journey, utilizing both mediums. And that's a really exciting thing, which, I think more and more is important to truly serve people. We have to kind of be open-minded and look to combine these different things together. So I think, what I'm trying to say is that you can't always know immediately for sure exactly what someone needs, and we should acknowledge that and understand that if you find yourself working with someone that needs something different from what you offer or isn't best suited, be open-minded, be creative, think win-win and collaborate, pull people together and create amazing offers that can help people. Don't be afraid to of course correct, I think is important to say.
Thank you, Simon. Steve, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I really like that, Simon. I think it speaks to the power of integration here, integration of therapy and coaching, what you're describing there. So it's not like a blurring, it's almost like a weaving together of the lines. If we're going to use a metaphor. I think that is the way forward if we really want to best serve people and their mental health. In terms of like the overlap, it probably happens in various different ways, different times. the commonality here is that we're dealing with complex, messy human beings, right? We're not dealing with a set of symptoms or a set of problems. Yes, those might present, but we're dealing with human beings, human-to-human stuff here. So I think that's important to remember. So there will always be a kind of overlap happening. I think what comes to mind for me is, in coaching, we talk about being client-led, right? We should be client-led here probably as much as possible, right? It's not about us telling the client, you need this, you need that. I think it's really respecting a client's agency and self-determination here, whilst educating and empowering the client as much as possible so they can make informed decisions for themselves about who they want to work with. And then just, I don't want to use cheesy metaphors here, but like just staying in your lane is important here. So yes, if the client decides, I do want to work with you, I trust you, but they might be still experiencing mental health problems, then as a coach, you know what not to do. You're not there to treat the mental health problem. You know what you are qualified to do. You're just really honing in there. Perhaps indirectly, you might end up helping improve their mental health problem, right? But your primary focus should be on the empowerment and the self-discovery and present and future focus and so on. So there'll be that overlap. And I think the ethical, effective way is really to sort of put the power back into the hands of the client.
Thank you, Steve. I'm going to move on to the next question now. I just wanted to double check we're all okay. I know that these questions can go quite heavy, so I just wanted to check everyone's okay before we move on. Yeah. Great. So is the blending of these disciplines a natural evolution or a challenge to their distinct purposes? Simon, did you want to start?
Yeah. Thanks. I think it's probably is a natural evolution. I think in terms of the need, I think that it's as the world is evolving, it's becoming more fast-paced, more complex, more challenging to live in, probably, and certainly to thrive in. And I think because of that, it's likely that people want what both therapy and coaching can offer, and we'll need both. So I think partly for that reason, I think time constraints that people have, we are in a culture where we tend to look for quick wins and quick fixes and everything to be fast and convenient. So I think for those reasons, quite practical reasons, they'll have to start to combine. A challenge to their distinct purposes. I mean, I think there's probably a world where there can be therapists, there can be coaches, and there could be therapeutic coaches. And some people will go to one or the other, or some people will go to people that can do both. And I think there's probably room for all of us and a need for all of those things. And so I'm not sure it has to be an or here, I guess is my answer. I think it's definitely a blending of, I think it's definitely going to happen. But I think that everyone can coexist at the very pure end of the spectrum on coaching or on therapy or a blend of the two. I think it's possible. And probably other stuff I could say, but I think that's the most important thing I'd like to contribute. Yeah, that's my thought.
Thanks, Simon. Steve, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, sure. I think it's probably a bit of both. I think it's a natural evolution because we're becoming increasingly aware that healing and growth happens simultaneously. If you think about the dual continuum model, we can be experiencing a mental health problem and be flourishing at the same time, and research validates that. I think we're becoming increasingly aware that we all have mental health all of the time, and so we can't, exclude mental health from coaching conversations, right? We'll all be bringing our mental health into those conversations. So it's a natural evolution, but I think that awareness is increasing. The challenge lies in respecting the boundaries, and that will apply differently from coach to coach, depending on their experience, depending on their capacities, and so forth. But we can also challenge each other to learn from the respective disciplines. There's probably many things therapists can learn from coaches and vice versa. Coaches can can learn, deep ethics from therapy. Therapists can learn about the importance of respecting a client's agency and self-determination from coaching, for example. So I think if we approach this in that kind of a spirit, where there's no professional elitism, and we try and drop the egos and really seek to learn from each other in service of the client, and I think we'd actually strengthen both disciplines. And like we mentioned earlier, if this can move towards an ecosystem where it's a really integrated community of therapists and coaches, similar to what you were saying, Simon, I think that would just be a win-win.
Thanks, Steve. Anita or Rebecca, was there anything that you wanted to add there?
Just to add that, where people are, I think since the pandemic, more aware of mental health, their own mental health, if they're struggling, more likely to get support. And for some people, coaching can be what we call a bit of a backdoor into therapy. So people might be resistant to going into therapy, but more open to working with the coach. And that can be almost like a stepping stone. So it might be bringing in some of those practices, but again, not going into the deeper work, which might support that client in what they need, and maybe getting to the point where they think or realize or actually recognize, or the need becomes a lot clearer that they do need therapy. So it can be a way of supporting people along their journey who might need more in the future.
Thanks so much, Anita. Rebecca, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think there's an absolute place for both coaching and therapy, and there is that evolution of some blending in that. I think the risk for me is that we dilute the specialist expertise of either approach. I think as a therapist if you're a therapist who's not been trained in coaching and you try to be a coach, you're probably going to be pretty ineffective, right? So leave the coaching to the coaching where you don't have that level of training or expertise in it. As we've talked about a lot already, kind of coaches being aware of your professional limitations and boundaries and holding those in mind. But I definitely think there's a place for both. And the more we can work together, learn from each other, have good conversations, case discussions, etc., then we can learn from one another.
Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, so question 6. How can professionals navigate these intersections to ensure client-centered care? Steve, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I think, first of all, by putting client front and center of their concern, right? It speaks to putting that ahead of our own egos. Understanding where that client might be on their journey. And I think, like Simon said earlier, you might not know that straight at the outset, but really seeking to understand where a client is, whether healing or growth is sort of a primary and necessary focus for them. Again, you can think of the dual continuum model as a heuristic for that. We should really help the client understand the differences again. So set that up right in the beginning, empower them, make it informed, so that they can make informed decisions. As I mentioned earlier, we're always going to be encountering a person's mental health. We can't extricate that from a coaching session. So as a coach, and this is why I love that Animas includes a whole module on presence, right? We need to really ensure that we are present and non-judgmental and, validating of our clients, especially if the client is experiencing, going through a challenging time, experiencing mental health problems. We want to create as psychologically safe a space as possible for our clients to, at the very least, ensure that we're not doing any harm. And then it's, I guess, just worth mentioning again that we can't overly generalize here, right? Not all coaches and therapists, for that matter, will be equally capable of meeting their clients in a transformative way if they're struggling, for example. And so I think understanding your own limitations, being honest with yourself about your own limitations or your own capacities, is really important, right? So yes, skills are important, but so are wisdom and humility. So I think really just coming back full circle, putting the client's needs front and center is probably the most important thing you can do to ensure client-centered care. I think I'm sort of stating the obvious.
Thank you, Steve. Rebecca, did you want to jump in there as well?
Yeah, I echo what Steve says. And I think it's really hard for people to understand as clients the difference between coaching and therapy. And then if you figure out the differences, then there's the whole array of different therapies and different coaching approaches. So it's our roles to help educate clients. And I think as professionals and training organizations to think what blogs or thought leadership pieces are we putting out there on our websites, etc., that help people understand that? How do we frame that in really simple language? If we're putting our profiles or bios up, how are we explaining who we are, who we can best work with, who we best can't work with, etc.? I think things on websites really helpful around having sort of clients you typically work with or case studies can be really helpful. And then when meeting with clients to really discuss their expectations, have a deep understanding of their needs, and in the contracting piece to make really clear kind of what you can help with. I think that's in sort of educating client and supporting them and empowering them to make the decisions. I think the casework we've talked about already, discussing cases between one another in supervision can be really useful, and building up those networks between coaches and therapists or particularly could be helpful. Anything else I was going to say? I think that's it for now.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I'm just conscious of time. I know we want to move on to the Q&A portion soon. We've got 3 questions left. So the next question I had, I'm going to start with you, Simon, for this one. How can coaches and therapists collaborate effectively to address complex client needs without overstepping professional boundaries?
Yeah, we've probably got a lot of all the info and the clues here for this, but I guess it's it's open communication from the beginning, understanding the client's needs, being honest, having integrity. I think on a practical level, I think for individuals to establish their own referral networks is a really powerful practical thing that you can do. If you're a coach or if you're a therapist, connect with a few people who have the opposite skill set and work with them so that, when people come your way that on for you have someone to refer them to and vice versa. And I think that's a world where everyone can thrive. The client benefits because they get to the right place, and you benefit as well because you're spending your time and energy on working with people that you should be working with. And really just kind of, I think all the stuff we've talked about today, that if we were to channel that, it would allow us to do that quite well.
Thank you, Simon. Rebecca, did you want to add anything there?
I think Simon's covered it all kind of within this piece, and another thought in answer to other questions. I think it's also really interesting as a therapist to have your own coaching as well as own therapy. And likewise, as coaches, the opportunity to have therapy and have coaching, you can learn a lot from going through that process yourself as well. So that's just another thought that came to mind.
Great, thank you. Penultimate question before we move on to the Q&A. How can clients be educated to understand the distinctions between coaching and therapy and choose the appropriate support for their needs? Anita, I'll start with you for this one.
I think it's that having the initial interactions to gauge what is your client's understanding of coaching and what are their expectations. And I think that can really tease out some of the, are there mismatched expectations? If it does it sound like they maybe need therapy more. So what I tend to do, I'll talk about, have you had the experience of coaching? Have you had the experience of therapy? And so to understand whether they had any of that before, and then educate a bit around, okay, what is the difference? Especially if they're sharing, what they want to work on. And for me, that will give a bit of an indication of, okay, I need to check in that is coaching the right thing, or is it therapy that's needed? And really, I think, going back to the whole contracting, this is how I work as a coach. This is the things that I can work on, and if ever I need to signpost, or it feels like something more is needed, or if there's risk, then I'll have that conversation with you. So I think it's really helping them to have it clear in their mind about what they can expect from me as a coach, and what the parameters of my work are. So I think that's probably the biggest thing is having the contracting piece. And as you go through, if you need to revisit that, if it feels like something has shifted, the needs have changed, and I think it's about revisiting.
Thank you, Anita. Steve, did you want to add on to anything there?
Yeah, sure, I'll add on. I mean, I think Anita's covered it well in terms of the responsibility of a coach. And it's an important question because I think we've already said how people can be confused about the two. If I were to get a bit practical, I think organizations like our own, Unmind, we create campaigns and help people better understand the differences between coaching and therapy. And I think we've already done that. And if I'm projecting in more towards the future, I think AI can play a really important role in educating and empowering as well, as long as that AI is designed by the right experts, it's grounded in science, the right guardrails in place. But I think AI can, at scale, really empower people, reduce stigma, and help them make informed decisions about their own mental health journey with clarity and confidence. So I think there's a big opportunity there, which is quite exciting.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Rebecca, did you have any thoughts there as well?
I think I sort of answered this question in my previous one around thinking about the information we share with clients on websites, for example, and how it is explained and who we work with, case studies, things like that. So that was going to be my point.
Thank you. Okay, final question. What role does supervision play in helping professionals navigate the ethical and practical challenges of integrating coaching and therapy? Simon.
Okay, so I've mentioned supervision a couple of times. That is just a really powerful, safe space, right, to explore complex cases and the grey areas, the nuance. Supervision is essentially what we do, but it's talking something out, it's breaking a problem down. It just creates a space for us to gain clarity, possibly lean into hard decisions as well, and be challenged or held accountable. In a supportive way. I think that's really, really important too, and just a space to kind of ground us and make any decisions that we need to make, whether that be short-term, immediate things like I'm working with a client and I feel that they might have needs that I can't support with, or maybe it's the bigger picture. Maybe it's talking about some of the things we just touched on in the previous question. Maybe it's how can my organization take more responsibility for communicating out the difference between therapy and coaching, or stuff like that. I think maybe that's more something that you may get from your own, if you have a business coach or mentor or something like that. But similar to supervision, it's just talking this problem out in a safe space. It's going to always be a positive thing. So yeah, that's my take on it. Very, very powerful and important.
Thank you, Simon. Rebecca, was there anything you wanted to share for that one as well?
Yeah, I think supervision is absolutely crucial to both professions. And I think considering individual supervision on a one-on-one basis, but also group supervision, so learning from one another is, as we know, hugely helpful. And I think that supervision space is helpful from a perspective thinking about your own professional development, to discuss how you're getting on to grow your own self-awareness, to help identify the boundaries that you might be crossing and think about how you might frame things or how you might be looking out for certain signs that coaching or therapy might not be the right approach for someone or they need something else. I think it's really important from a sort of quality assurance piece in some ways as well, as you reviewing your own practice and how you're getting on with clients and the kind of outcomes and sort of monitor your professional boundaries as well. And a supervisor can help spot things that you might not realize yourself. Really important to find a good supervisor that you feel comfortable with. And just, really help, I think, with discussing some of the complexity that we see in individuals that we work with and some of the dilemmas we face and how to manage that, whether to refer on or not. And last thing, I think supervision is really helpful just for us and our own well-being and to prevent burnout, to have that space where we can talk and share some of the challenges and how we're feeling and some of the difficult things we hear from people sometimes is quite a challenge.
Thanks, Rebecca. Brilliant. So that is the kind of my questions come to an end, and now we're going to take some time for everyone on this call to join in the conversation. So if you've got any questions, please do type them into the chat now. I had a couple questions come through whilst people were talking. So I'm going to start with the first question. I actually forget who it was that sent it to me, but if you are trained as both a therapist and a coach, can you offer therapy and coaching to one client either simultaneously or alternating between the two? So I'm trying to think who's the best person to ask. Does anyone immediately want to answer that question?
I'm happy to. I think for me, I just wanted to clarify. It was about if you're trained in therapy and coaching, can you offer therapy and coaching to someone?
Yeah. So if you're trained as both a therapist and a coach, can you offer therapy and coaching to one client either simultaneously or alternating between the two?
Sure. Okay. I mean, I guess can you or can you? I maybe, I guess everyone may have different opinions on this. I'm interested to hear what everyone thinks, but for me, I'm not trained on therapy. I'm a coach, but I work with therapeutic coaches or coaches who are also therapists, and they will offer it simultaneously, and I've seen it be very powerful and effective. And they participate in group supervision to understand, again, how it's playing out and where the boundaries are and if there's any problems or challenges presented by looking to do that. And again, I think if the level of competence and training is solid and high in both areas, and that person feels, I think this is the key, right? Maybe as I'm talking out, if they feel confident and competent to do both and to blend them, and that it's in the best interest of the client, then I think that's okay. And I work with people who do that and have been in group supervision sessions with them and picking some of that work. So that's maybe a reference point and a bit of a point of view from me that hopefully is helpful.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to jump in there, Rebecca? I'm wondering if this one might be a good one for you.
Yeah, I think for me, it's about being really clear with clients about what they're wanting and what you're offering. If somebody goes into coaching and that's what they're expecting and hoping for, and you go into a therapeutic space that somebody isn't wanting or expecting, then that can be obviously unhelpful for the client. But of course, if there's a need to go there, the client's up for it, you feel skilled and qualified and able to go there, then that could be helpful. So I think it's having that conversation with the client and reviewing and checking in with them. I think the other thing is just be aware around any sort of legal requirements. If you're sort of practicing as one, are you able to practice as the other in terms of the company that you're working for? In some countries, the licensure, etc. It's important to hold in mind.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question now from Elaine. Does supervision always need to be carried out by a qualified supervisor, or can it be effective if it's simply to be carried out by someone in a team who is willing to facilitate informal peer-to-peer support? Rebecca, I might start with you for this one again.
So I can only speak from a therapy perspective with this one. And as therapists, we should be having supervision from qualified trained supervisors where possible. However, peer supervision with others is hugely helpful as well, and I think is good to have alongside that supervision. I can't answer this one for coaching.
Happy to say, I think for coaching, it's not regulated in the same way. So you don't have to be qualified to provide supervision as a coach, although you can be, and that can be really helpful. But again, I think peer supervision is really powerful. It's about holding space and talking things out between two of you, if it's one-on-one, or between the group of people that are all that are all skilled, that are all trained, that all have knowledge and experience to draw on, and can use the exact frameworks and principles we use in coaching to hold space and supervision and create clarity. I don't think any damage can be done from supervision. Again, it's non-directive, right? So no one's actually throwing out opinions where we're using the same things that we practice every day. So that's my thoughts from a coaching perspective.
So Vivian asks, do you think you can be a life coach and a therapist as separate businesses? Anita, I might come to you with that one.
Funny, because that's what I'm going to be doing this year. So yeah, I think again it goes back to the previous question. How do I answer this? It's what are you contracting for? So be clear. If you're a coach and a coach and a therapist, whatever client you're working with, contracting at the start and setting expectations of what it is that they're looking for. So if it's coaching they want, so ensuring that you're staying within that remit with that client. If someone's wanting therapy, then you're making sure you're working to that framework and being clear of kind of that division. But equally, as some of the others said earlier, there is blurring, and there are points where you can combine the two. But again, it's about the contracting. What is the client expecting? And knowing that for yourself to make sure you're not kind of going into the opposite, the other kind of area when that's not being asked for or required. And again, it's a checking in with your client in terms of how is it going? Is this working for you? And making sure, you're staying within those boundaries.
Thank you, Anita. Did anyone want to add on to that one?
I was just going to say, I think it's an interesting question. So I'm trained as a therapist, and I started training to be a coach, and then COVID hit. And I've never picked it back up properly since. So I'd love to be a coach. But somebody posed a question to me a few years ago, which is, do we want breadth in our profession, or do we want depth? And sometimes I've asked myself, do I want to train as a coach? But there's also lots for me to be doing in therapy, and to be really growing the depth of what I'm doing in therapy. And then if I'm training as a coach, that's a lot of work as well. So I think I'm just kind of rephrasing the question a little bit, but I think sometimes it's useful for us to think about what do we want, and do we want to be both? And there's absolutely, there's good reasons to do that as well. But as Anita, you could probably say it's a lot of work. And do we want to do everything, or can we grow that depth in the approach that we're offering? So just be the thought there.
And just to add to that is I became a coach, but then realized I wanted to work in more depth and be able to cover more areas. So that's the reason why I wanted to do that as well. So I think, and it can, I suppose, work the other way. So it's knowing what you want as well, what makes you come alive, what's your purpose, what's your passion, and how you want to work.
Thanks, Anita. Laura asks, solution-based therapy is also similar to coaching. I have a client about to access both. How do you see those going together? Shall I start with Simon?
I don't know much about solution-based therapy. I'll put that out there. But I think it's coming to me, the more we talk, the more I'm aware that we're all talking about, again, we're talking a language that most of the time our clients don't have for a framework. So we all know there's a distinct difference between coaching, therapy, mentoring, right, and consulting is the other one that's sometimes brought into that sphere. We all define them and split them out, and we've discussed how many nuances and grey areas there are today. But we might know if we're using therapy or coaching, or a certain form of therapy or a certain form of coaching. And so I think, but someone coming into our world probably just has a problem they want to fix, and they have no understanding of necessarily at the very beginning, do I need a coach? Do I need therapy? And often they might not care, to be honest, right? They have a problem that they want to deal with. They feel a certain way and they want that to change. Sometimes people aren't even clear what change they want at the very beginning. Or what they're aiming towards, they just know what they want to move away from. So this is such a general answer, but I think what I'm saying is, without knowing enough about the solution therapy, I think that if you feel, if you are led by what the client wants and you lean on the skill sets that you have, I think for me, that's really important. Again, as long as we're respecting the boundaries and being ethical, etc. Just think it's really important to understand people have problems they want to solve, and it's just about us being able to know confidently that we can help them. And if that's the case, if you can answer that question, then I think it's go for it.
Thank you, Simon. Am I okay to move on to the next question? Does anyone want to add anything to that question? Great. So Piers asks, I am a coach and I volunteer with the Samaritans. And for overseas participants, the Samaritans is a phone helpline with the vision that fewer people die by suicide. I have had some coaching clients talk about suicidal thoughts, and I feel safe/capable in holding a space to do this. Do the panel have a perspective on a situation like this? Steve, I might come to you with that one, if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, I have a perspective that would, I guess, most of the time be seen as a red flag and a cause for potentially referring onto an appropriate mental health professional. I'd be keen to what Rebecca thinks about that and how we might navigate that at Unmind, for example. But it might come down to the person in question and their prior experience or capacity to hold space, right? But I do see that as a red flag. Yeah.
Rebecca, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think the Samaritans do amazing work. I think it's going back to what role you're in as a coach. The client is expecting you to be a coach and you've contracted around that. And if suicidal thoughts are raised by somebody, for example, it's good to know how to support them with that to some degree, to be able to signpost them. But the Samaritan training is also not therapy training. So you wouldn't be able to necessarily work with somebody continuously into therapy with that. But I think recognizing if someone discloses suicidal thoughts, that's you've obviously created a safe space that they can raise that. But I think signposting or referring on to the support services that somebody might need for that, which may actually not be therapy, it may be kind of crisis interventions and GP, etc. as well. It's very important.
Yeah. Anita, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think I'll probably echo what Rebecca was saying. It's, you can hold the space if you're with someone who is disclosing something or is in that sort of place where they feel like they might have suicidal thoughts and ideation. So again, I think it's critical that the person's not left with that, and it is about what can you add, what is it. So it goes back to the signposting, what's needed, and what might be causing those thoughts and feelings is maybe best placed to work with in a therapeutic setting. I think it goes back to the risk and the risk of going into what might be causing those kind of thoughts and experiences.
Thank you, Anita. So from Andrew, oh no, sorry, wrong name there. Michael, where might somatic coaching sit within this conversation? As a somatic coach, I've had clients express that the session felt very much like therapy. Often emotion emerges due to working in a body-orientated and person-centered way. Some individuals feel more comfortable with the idea of coaching as opposed to therapy. Does anybody have any thoughts on that one?
I think Michael is a great example of how nuanced this conversation is, and how many forms there are of coaching and of therapy. I can understand why people may say that after a session that it felt like therapy, because the process that they would go to, you could describe it as therapeutic, but it's therapy. You feel therapeutic. It's therapeutic just to talk out a problem, right? So sometimes a weight lifts from a client at the very beginning of a coaching session, just when they give you a 5-minute download on everything that's happened. You could use the word therapeutic as an adjective in that case, but which is different from the modality of the actual modality that you're using, therapy or coaching. So I think possibly, again, it's I'm coming back to that idea that the people we work with don't have the language and framework that we operate from. They can just express how things feel to them or what they think. And I think that's possibly okay. I guess if you are a somatic coach, you're working towards a goal and creating change proactively. You're doing that through the body, through somatic practices. So there's no question that it is coaching, but it's understandable why they may feel, and they may have described it as therapeutic. And yes, I just like on the last part of the question, I do think that some people may feel more comfortable with the idea of coaching over therapy. That's probably a really important thing, maybe didn't come up today, is certain personality types, certain types of people. And I think particularly men often feel that that therapy is some form of weakness, which of course it is not. But to say I have a coach feels okay for some people. To say I have a therapist doesn't. That feels too vulnerable, right? Too weak. And I think that's a really, really, really important thing. That's part of this discussion. But I'm not going to say anymore. It's going to lose that out there. I don't know if anyone else wanted to add.
I just wanted to add that when I first started coaching, and within the first few coaching sessions, I had clients who would express the emotion by crying, and I thought, oh my God, this is coaching. Why is this kind of emotion coming up? But it's natural. If people are talking about deeply emotive topics which are important to them, emotions can come through, and I think somatic work is a great way of connecting with some of those emotions that you typically might not be able to engage with. And I think it's that distinction between when the emotion becomes difficult to regulate and it's overwhelming, over consuming, and it goes over long periods of time. That's when I think there might be a red flag in terms of what the client needs. But if they're using somatics to express and maybe process emotion, that can be really helpful. And if they can walk away and not be at risk and able to regulate their emotion, then I think that feels safe. And especially I think for the training for somatic work, you would have been taught guidelines, tools, ways to keep clients safe. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Thanks, Anita. So I think we have time for one more question. There was a question that was asked again before we called for Q&A, so I'm really sorry I don't have this person's name. I just jotted it down on my notes here. But what about the risk of undoing what a therapist is doing if you continue coaching? Also, by doing both therapy and coaching, isn't there a risk of overparenting? And how do you ensure there is space for growth, agency, and empowerment if doing both? Does anyone want to jump in with that one? Steve?
Well, I just want to say, I mean, I've becoming distracted by all of the comments on the side here. It seems like there are people here who would be well equipped to like answer such a question. So, I mean, I might be overstepping my role here, but I mean, I invite the perspective from some of the people who've been sharing comments here. I think there's people who are coaches and therapists and supervisors and the like. So I'd love to hear from them.
Yeah, I mean, again, I was also scrolling through a lot of the comments that people are saying, really interesting. We have got 3 minutes left, so it might take a while, but I'll definitely save the chat so that if anyone wants to read it back, that would be totally fine. But yeah, really, really interesting perspectives.
Just on the question, I just think it's about, again, everyone's different, every journey's different. The way everyone interacts with a coach or a therapist is different and unique as well. And I think answering the question is about regularly checking in with your client and assessing and understanding how they're interacting with both modalities. Of course, the frequency of coaching and therapy, the types of coaching and therapy that are going on. I think if you might be a leadership coach over here doing some supporting a business owner to make leadership decisions, but that same person's going through psychotherapy, for example, there might be very little overlap in those two things, and they might be able to coexist really, really well. But that's just one example. But there's many different scenarios, so I think it's about evaluating each one. It's shades of grey rather than black or white with stuff like this, I think.
Great. We've got about a minute left, so I might wrap up there if that's okay. Steve, you started saying something? I didn't know if you wanted to finish. All good. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here tonight. And like Steve said, I'm reading through a lot of the comments that have been shared, and it sounds like something that we could kind of talk about all day. So I really, really do appreciate everybody and their inputs here. I'd also love to share that we're doing this ahead of our mental health and coaching program, which you can find all the information on our website. Steve, Anita, and Simon will also be speaking and leading sessions during that program. So it'd be great to see as many of you there as possible. Rebecca, Anita, Stephen, Simon are all on LinkedIn, I believe. So if you want to connect with them, please do. Unmind is an absolutely incredible organisation, so please do check out Unmind. And with that, I'm going to draw the session to a formal close. This will be recorded and you can access it on our YouTube channel soon. And yes, thank you so much, everybody. Really, really appreciated being here tonight with you all, and really interesting perspectives being shared. And thank you, Rebecca, Anita, Steve, and Simon. It's been brilliant.
Thank you, Izzy. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.